Hello, today I'm on my crummy DK to talk about buffs and debuffs that don't require a lot of attention, but that you need to be alerted to when they're about to drop off. These would be things where you're not going to screw up your rotation or priority system to refresh them, but you want to know you've got 10 seconds to reapply Fairy Fire or it'll drop off. I don't really have a class that has a long-term raid buff like an Affliction Lock or Fairy Fire from a Druid, or I guess Affliction Lock will cast Curse of Elements. But I do have a DK which has diseases that aren't really a core part of your rotation. You want to keep them up, but the number of ticks remaining isn't important. It's not so bad if you refresh them with 5 seconds remaining versus 1 second remaining. There's a lot more flexibility than with my Priest, where I need to know very precisely how much time is left to maximize my damage. So to that end, I'm going to make 2 auras, one for each of my diseases, and they're going to track my debuffs in a slightly different way from my Priest. Rather than having timers, what I'm going to want is something that says, hey, you've got 5 seconds left on Blood Plague. You'd better recast it eventually. I also want something that says, hey, this mob doesn't even have diseases up. It's time you get those up because it's important to have those. It buffs, obliterates, and they provide raid utility too. But I certainly don't want them to be progress bars. I'm not going to be babysitting my diseases that closely. I just want to know that sometime in your next set of runes you should reapply these. So I'm going to start by making 2 icons. I'm going to make them real quick. I'm going to call this one Frost Fever, and this one will be Blood Plague. You can see I'm making them together because I want to make use of groups to do multiple configuration at the same time. I could set one up and then duplicate it, but I like this way a little better. So I'm going to call this DK Dots is probably a good name. I'm going to move these in. There we go. So I have a couple of things here. I'm going to change the group layout a little bit, maybe 10 pixels. I'll lay these out so they grow to the right, I guess. Align to the bottom. Then I'm going to come to the display settings for these. I'm going to uncheck automatic icon. The reason for that is because I'm going to be using the inverse option. So if I just do that now, it'll be something that I'm reminded to do. The size of these is probably a little much. I'm going to make these maybe 36. And I'm going to change the font. I think I'll put it outside the group. Something a little different. So we'll say top outside. But I'll make it a bit bigger so it's easy to read. And I think I want these to line up over top of my casting bar on the left-hand side. I know my casting bar is 400 pixels wide, so that means I can go X minus 200, and they'll line up on the left edge. And I'm going to attach this to the bottom of the screen and offset it by something like 340 is probably right. That looks okay. So we've got the basic shape of our auras set up. I'm going to set some load conditions. So I'm going to restrict to in combat on a Death Knight. And that's probably enough. It doesn't really matter what spec I am. I'm going to want these to appear probably on all 3. And I think we're pretty good. The last thing to do is set up the specific triggers, and those are different for each of these. A trigger for Frost Fever is not the same as one for Blood Plague. But they are pretty close, so I can do that at the group level as well and say these are triggers as auras on the target. It's a debuff cast by the player, so own only. And then I can come through and I can say aura name. I'll just do the first one here, so Frost Fever. So now these are all identical, and that's no good. But I can just come to Blood Plague and say Blood Plague. So at the group level, you'll see the aura name is blue, and that tells you that there's a difference between the elements in the group. Whereas things like unit and aura type, they're yellow, that means they're the same. So that looks okay. What else can we do? I think under group, I'm going to put some animation in there because it's easy. And also, I'm going to use some preset animations for the auras themselves. So we'll say slide to left and slide from left. So they're going to just kind of shoot in and shoot out. Let's go and attack this mob here. See, we're in combat, and if I cast Blood Plague, that appears. So it's tracking the auras pretty well. I need something that has no debuffs on it. So there we go. And as I cast them, these appear. And this sort of a layout might be good for my priest, where I want to track the time remaining very carefully. But I actually want the opposite. I want to track the time remaining only when there's a few seconds left. If there's plenty of time left, or the auras are not on the mob, if the auras are not on the mob, or there's plenty of time left, those are different sorts of conditions. I want to know you need to cast this, and the times I need to cast that are when it's not on the mob or when it won't be on the mob in 10 seconds. So to that end, I'm just going to come to the trigger, and I'm going to use this remaining time option. So I'm going to say, let's trigger these when there are more than, let's say less than, sorry. Actually, more than's fine. 33 seconds. Actually, let's say 30 seconds. Realistically, I would use probably 5 or 6 seconds here, but because I'm testing, I want to hit this limit very quickly. So I'm going to set it to 30 now, and then I'll adjust it later. Just come in, and I cast the buff on the mob. You can see it's tracking the one, and now the other. As long as I keep them both up, they'll appear. But I want the opposite sort of behavior. I want them to appear only when it's missing or nearly missing. So I'll put invert on. Now we can come up here and get in combat. These have a short amount of time remaining, but if I cast them both, they clear up. If I go and attack this mob, which has neither, they both appear. As I put them up, they get pushed away. And then as the time remaining gets low, they come back. So that's about the right behavior, apart from the fact that the remaining time is 30 seconds. So we're doing pretty good. We just need to get a couple of other things working right. The first is obviously the icons, and the second is the timer. Inverse doesn't really work nicely with those two things. It's just the nature of the way WeakAuras works. But it's easy enough to fix. I can come into display and choose a custom icon for Frost Fever. Frost Fever. And I can do the same for Blood Plague. And now they'll at least look right. So we come in, I'm in combat, I need to cast Frost Fever and Blood Plague, and they've gone away. There's not much time left, and they come back again. There we go. So that's roughly correct. All I want to do now is add a timer above these. And I want the timer to show something like 5.2 seconds remaining. So on a standard aura, you could just use the display text option for that. You could put in %p. But because we're using inverse and we're doing some kind of funny stuff, we need to write a custom function. So to do that, I'm just going to come in and say %c, choose OK. And we've done some custom Lua before. This is going to be a little more complicated, but not too much, I hope. Hopefully something you can modify easily enough for another disease. So the first thing I'm going to do is say local disease name equals, I don't know, Frost Fever is probably fine. So this is the disease that I'm going to be trying to track, and I'm just putting it in a variable so I can change it once here, and it'll filter through the rest of the code. I won't have to make multiple edits. So what I want to do is say, does this mob have a disease by this name on it, cast by the player? And if it does, then I want to know at what time will this debuff expire. If it has that debuff and it's going to expire, I can compare the time it will expire with the time it is now. And the difference between those two times will tell me how many seconds are remaining. So let's start working towards that end. I'm going to say local disease equals, and we've used the unit aura function before. I'm going to use one called unit debuff, which works more or less the same way. So I want a debuff from the target called, and well, I could type in frost fever here. Because I've stored frost fever in a variable, I'm just going to use that variable here instead. So disease name, the rank, which I don't need, and then a filter that says cast by the player. So this is going to say, hey, target, do you have a debuff cast by the player named frost fever? And if it does, it's going to return the disease. Then what I'm going to want to do? Well, I'm going to want to return something with this. So let's say return time remaining. And I should probably define time remaining before we go any further. I'm going to say local time remaining equals, I'm just going to say nothing for now. So now there's two possible options. One is that I have no disease, in which case I'm going to want to return nothing. And the other is I have a disease on there, and I'm going to want to calculate how much is actually left and update what time remaining actually contains. So I can say if there's a disease, if disease, then do some stuff. And the stuff I'm going to want to do is, well, first I'm going to want the length of, I'm going to want to know what time it is. So I'm going to say local time now is, and get time tells you what time it is. The second thing I'm going to want to know is how much time is left on the debuff. And unit debuff contains all of that information if it finds a disease. Just like unit aura, it returns the name, the expiration time, the duration, the caster, stuff like that. And I know that the expiration time is held in the 7th option. So I'm going to say local time expires equals select 7. I'm just going to cut and paste because I'm lazy. So expires time, or time expires, contains when this thing will expire. Time now contains what time it is now. I need to find the difference between these two. So I'm going to say local time left equals time expires minus time now. That's a pretty simple difference. And then I can return it. And I'll be returning that by putting it in time remaining. Now, these times are extremely precise. If I just did the simple subtraction, I'm going to get a number like, I don't know, 5.12765300012 seconds left. And that's just way too much noise. What I really want is just something like 5.2. So I'm going to round it off by using a simple string format. So I'm going to say time remaining, the thing I'm returning, is equal to string.format, and I can put a string, and then I'm going to put in time left. So in my string, I'm going to use a %, which says put an integer or a floating point number here, and the number after the dot is how many decimal places I want. So if I put in 0.3, it would say, okay, I'm going to put a 3 decimal place floating point number in here. So it would be something like 12.123. I could put in 0.1, and then it would be something like 12.5, or I could put in %0, and that would be just a straight integer. 12.1234 would just get rounded off to 12. I think 12.1 is going to be good. And you just need the F to tell the system that it's a floating point number you're going to be putting in here. So %.1f will do the rounding for us. And hopefully this will work as advertised and I won't look like a chump. I'm going to come in and just say, put that up. So we have Blood Plague. And there we go. They're ticking away. And they show exactly the same time, even though they're clearly different. And the reason for that is because both auras got the same function. That's one of the nice things about using WeakAuras groups, is that I can edit the function up at this level, and it gets pasted into both of these individually. But you'll notice when we did the function, we put the disease name in a variable up at the top. And the reason for that is because now I can say, okay, this one is Frost Fever, I just leave that alone. This one is Blood Plague, so I can type that in here instead. Blood Plague. Maybe I'll capitalize that just for consistency. And now I won't have to go through and put the disease name both here and here. So that'll have updated that. Now if I cast Frost Fever up, I'll put up Blood Plague. You can see there's 27 seconds and 30 on this, so they're different. They're actually tracking the right things now. If I put that up again, we'll just make sure that our timers are correct. So there we go. They're working as advertised. You can see we have nothing if the disease isn't even up, and a timer if it is up. So because those are all working, I can now just come to my dots and say, don't alert me when there's 30 seconds left, alert me when there's, say, 6 seconds left. And that's it. So now we have things that will alert me while I'm doing my standard rotation, only when I actually need to consider recasting those debuffs. So on a Death Knight, Howling Blast is going to keep Frost Fever stacked most of the time. So I can be using all of my Unholy Runes on Obliterates, or something like Pestilence, I suppose, or D&D, but realistically it's probably going to be Obliterates. And then once we get down to 6 seconds or less remaining, we're going to get an icon here that says, hey, you probably want to consider using a Death Rune or an Unholy Rune to put up your Blood Plague. And if I go to a new mob, maybe something spawned, we get 2 icons saying these aren't even up yet. So this custom function would work just as well for something like, I don't know, Curse of Elements or Fairy Fire or Sunder Armor. You could do the same sort of thing just by putting in a different debuff name for the aura, and then in that custom display function up here. So it's a slightly different way of building a UI to track a debuff. Hopefully you might find that useful.